Good afternoon. You guys are going to have to excuse my posture while I'm talking, because true to form, I'm still recovering from a weightlifting injury. And then, I guess, before I get started, the only other thing I want to say is, like, if people want to exchange contact information after I'm done speaking to, like, continue the discussion or get resources about what I'm talking about, please do that. I think in a lot of things like this, like, people can get kind of weird about that, like when they get done talking or whatever, so don't be skittish about speaking to me if you want to. And yeah, I might have to like run outside for 5 minutes. Alright, so I'm gonna drink some water and I'll get started. Alright. In 2016, the University of Chicago's Office of the Dean of Students released a statement to the class of 2020 concerning its pedagogical and scholarly principles, specifically its commitment to academic freedom and opposition to practices such as safe spaces and trigger warnings. Stating a commitment to a free exchange of ideas, not only between students and professors, but also in civil society more broadly, the office noted that the University of Chicago would not cancel upcoming appearances by speakers, regardless of the speaker's views or the purported content of their lectures. In short, the University of Chicago made a clear statement to its incoming freshmen that its values were incompatible with those practices, and that they viewed them incompatible with intellectual diversity and the free exchange of ideas. That is, they viewed trigger warnings, safe spaces, and no platforming as impediments to the university's mission and directly counterposed to its values. In closing, the statement noted that the university's positions on these practices had been the site of controversy in the past, and enclosed a short monograph by the dean of the college recounting the various debates and scandals concerning the struggle for academic freedom at that institution in the past. These struggles over values in higher education had certainly raged on at the University of Chicago. It is also true that debates over practices like trigger warnings and safe spaces had had some visibility in the years before 2016, and have become even more visible since then. In the period since, debates about trigger warnings, safe spaces, and other issues of inclusion and accessibility in higher education have spilled over into the mainstream and found themselves folded into larger cultural struggles and narratives. For one example, we see the specter of the trigger warning begin to appear in debates about generational politics, and the term triggered has taken on a pejorative connotation, which indicates that a given person is overly sensitive and possibly in need of some tough love. The question of the trigger warning has also found itself folded into debates about higher education occurring outside of the university itself, and found itself standing in for larger critiques of the institution. Namely, that the universities are dominated by radical leftists who use practices such as trigger warnings and safe spaces to push their own political agendas. It may seem contradictory to the reader that these practices are taken to be dominant in the university, when schools like the University of Chicago have issued statements quite to the contrary. One might also suggest that the interpolation of these questions into debates and discussions far beyond their initial context has distorted their meaning, or at least that the terms and practices involved have taken on meanings and significance in no way consonant with the way their practitioners understand them. Thus, trigger warnings, having formerly been a practice employed by feminist internet forums and community activists, have now taken on new lives as ideographs in larger cultural struggles. This process, while possibly inevitable, presents a number of new problems for those concerned with issues of equity in the American university, especially advocates of trauma-informed pedagogy, the constellation of practices and values within which students and instructors alike encounter the trigger warning in the safe space. 1. Public and political perceptions of universities as dominated by trauma-informed pedagogical practices mask long-standing and ongoing struggles within the university in a manner intensified by their interpolation into larger political struggles in the American context. 2. The cultural struggle within the university concerning trauma-informed pedagogy, while much more coherent and focused than the larger public debate, itself obscures and conceals a larger question within the university. one of such magnitude that its significance approaches that of an existential question. At this juncture, I will, at the risk of confusing the reader, not only loop back to the University of Chicago's statement, but also, in a perverse sense, concur with it. This is to say that while I of course disagree with the university's posture, I do agree that trauma-informed pedagogy is, in a certain sense, counterposed against the university's values. I do again, perhaps in a perverse way, share the opinion that the question of trauma-informed pedagogy is of such significance that it would warrant such a response. In short, I argue that the debate over trigger warnings and safe spaces, grouped together as trauma-informed pedagogies henceforth, is in fact the most visible manifestation of the larger question of whom and what the university is for. I intend to demonstrate this not only by unconcealing the political economic underpinnings of the debate, but also by clarifying the origin of trauma-informed pedagogies and the particular problems they were developed to address. In demonstrating the connection between these issues in teaching and the larger agenda of austerity within and without the university, I will show that issues of trauma, both personal and political, are the linchpin of the cultural struggles within the university, and challenge the particularly problematic notion that trauma-informed pedagogies run counter to pedagogy more broadly. In short, I intend to demonstrate that trauma-informed pedagogies and practices do in fact help diverse groups of students learn and succeed, and that the hostile response to them from certain factions are testament to the success of these pedagogies. Regarding public universities serving diverse and vulnerable students, I will argue that this question is especially pressing. And in closing, note that the paradox wherein trauma-informed pedagogy's most vocal proponents are primarily operating in our nation's most elite institutions. All right. So, trauma-informed pedagogy has become a complex constellation of ideas over the last 2 decades. And it seems likely that an effort to fully explain its history and significance would be unable to do it justice in this exercise. Put simply, especially in the United States, trauma-informed pedagogies are theories and practices of teaching which center on the observation that many, if not most, students have had traumatic experiences in the past. Moving forward, trauma-informed pedagogies often build on empirical studies of the relationship between trauma and brain development, specifically in terms of how the findings of these studies bear on the relationship between trauma and learning. For example, an elementary school in Lynn, Massachusetts received a grant to develop a trauma committee which identified students struggling with trauma in their home lives and made calculated interventions which improved their classroom disposition and academic performance. Particularly in public schools and low-income communities, trauma-centered approaches have seen demonstrable success in focusing on the relationship between trauma and learning, noting how the former often serves as an impediment to the latter, down to the level of cognition and stress response itself. To introduce the argument of these studies, the idea is that students with traumatic experiences live in a constant state of emergency, in which seemingly commonplace stimuli in their environment can provoke an instant fight or flight stress response. These stimuli, both in psychology and in the parlance of trauma-informed pedagogy, are known as trauma triggers. Scholars have also demonstrated that it is not only trauma triggers which impede a student's ability to learn, but also the constant feeling of apprehension and anxiety which some students experience. In short, the science indicates that students who experience these various stress responses consequently have trouble retaining new information, learning new skills, participating in classroom activities, and completing assignments. Thus, educators have developed pedagogical methods centered on students' traumatic pasts in the hope that instructional methods and classroom management practices designed to make students feel comfortable and supported in the classroom can improve their learning outcomes and overall success. In short, trauma-informed pedagogies are ideas which build from empirical research on trauma and cognition, seeking to make the classroom more accessible for the students who often find it most challenging. My introduction of this trauma-informed paradigm may raise the question of what these issues and responses have to do with higher education. After all, the University of Chicago is a very different learning environment from a public elementary school in a low-income neighborhood. Moreover, It stands to reason that while an 8-year-old has little choice in where they go to school, a student who disagrees with the University of Chicago's pedagogical philosophy can certainly choose another college. I raise this point not to answer it at this moment, but to demonstrate that I'm aware of the contradiction. I do, however, plan to contend with it shortly. As I noted a moment ago, in the literature on trauma and pedagogy, a trauma trigger is an event, image, idea, utterance, or action which triggers a stress response in a person with past traumatic experiences. The example which most readily comes to mind is sexual assault and intimate partner violence, although these two issues are by no means the horizon of potential trauma triggers. A trigger warning, then, is a notice, either verbal or in writing, that the content of a given lesson, text, or discussion contains potential trauma triggers. Emanating from feminist online spaces in the late 90s, the trigger warning serves a simple functional purpose: giving participants in a given community or discourse notice that the content involved may be triggering, and an opportunity to choose how they will respond to that information. Rather than simply excusing people from participation based on their experiences, trigger warnings build from one of the most important principles of trauma-informed pedagogy, that recognizing the agency of traumatized people allows them to feel empowered and in control of what they experience. This is to say that when one encounters a trigger warning, they can decide how they wish to proceed, or even prepare themselves for potentially being triggered. Of course, someone can always choose not to participate in a discussion or encounter certain materials. And of course, this may present additional challenges to whatever community they're involved in. Responding to this observation by opposing trigger warnings, however, implies that additional challenges are a reason to deny access or participation to the people who present them. Given the prevalence of sexual assault and intimate partner violence alone, this would by definition exclude many women from these communities or practices. If we expand the locus of trauma triggers and correlate them to the groups most likely to experience them, again, based on empirical research, it comes into clear view that trigger warnings alone can be a threshold for participation and full belonging to communities which engage in certain discussions. To reiterate, a trigger warning is not a warning of content which people may experience as upsetting or challenging. A trigger warning is, in most cases, a warning of content which has been demonstrated by empirical research to produce a stress response at the level of cognition in people with certain experiences. Under this working definition, a trigger warning also builds on empirical research in seeking to give individuals with traumatic experiences an opportunity to feel empowered and in control of how they experience the given content. Reflecting on these observations, it seems clear how trigger warnings would make their way to the academy. Equity, accessibility, and empowerment are values many academics share, especially those in public or open access institutions. Even in elite institutions, cultural struggles about access and parity have produced an environment fertile for discussions of trigger warnings and how learning spaces can be made more accessible and ultimately successful. Perhaps paradoxically, it is in more competitive institutions where trigger warnings and other trauma-informed pedagogical methods have taken root most powerfully, examples including Oberlin College. At first glance, this would seem strange. While intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and other commonly understood trauma triggers certainly occur without regard for class and race, it seems like common sense to note that the traumas of war, hunger, gun violence, food insecurity, and toxic stress are visited most acutely on our most vulnerable and marginalized students. In turn, this would suggest that the most vulnerable and marginalized students would be the most in need of trauma-informed pedagogies. Here, I will pause to assert the following. First, I concur that it appears paradoxical that trauma-informed pedagogies do not seem to have taken root in the institutions which could most benefit from them. However, I argue that what appears to be a paradox is in fact a structural trend with an important purpose, albeit one we should find odious. Second, while it might seem like the opponents of trigger warnings are either ignorant to the logic behind them or indifferent to their potential for accessibility, this phenomenon too has a certain logic and purpose, again, one which we should find odious. In reflecting on what I have presented so far, it may appear that opponents of trigger warnings are merely working from an older view of pedagogy and are unwilling to entertain new ways of thinking or being in the classroom. Particularly in cases where the rhetoric of academic freedom is presented as a counterpoint to the specter of the trigger warning, this argument holds a great deal of weight. And in countering the argument that trigger warnings impinge on academic freedom, it is an easy retort that this line of thinking simply implies that the rights of some stakeholders to participate fully in a learning community trump those of others. Thus, the right of an instructor to discuss certain topics or assign certain materials to meet their own pedagogical goals trumps the right of some students to feel comfortable in their classroom or succeed. In this case, we could retort that we are allowing the ego of a given instructor to take precedent over the ability of some students to learn in their classroom. At the same time, however, given the assault on tenure protections currently underway in the American university, we can understand how instructors would resent further external impositions on their autonomy. In a certain way, we have been presented with a contradiction. The cultural struggle over pedagogical principles may appear intractable. However, this narrow conception of the conflict falls apart instantly in the face of one observation and one question. Observing that most university instructors are not only untenured, but not currently on a tenure track, we note that questions of academic freedom and the tenure system are not immediately relevant to what happens in most university classrooms. Once we account for general education courses like basic writing and first-year composition, instruction tilts even more toward contingent faculty and graduate students. And the question that I have is this: what if there is in fact an ongoing effort to make higher education less accessible? And would that not mean that arguments against trauma-informed pedagogy may unwittingly fold into one side of a much deeper conflict? From an outside perspective, the notion that any power would be working to make higher education less accessible would appear either unlikely, unthinkable, or appalling. Especially since the post-war era, a university education has been viewed as a surefire pathway to middle-class success and belonging, and American academics have engaged in all manner of decades-long projects to expand access to it. Famously, the City University of New York was not only made open access, but also tuition-free, resulting in an influx of unprepared and diverse students. For rhetoric and writing scholars like myself, this phenomenon was the exigence for the development of basic writing pedagogies and increased interest in improving academic outcomes for diverse groups of students. In the wake of desegregation and affirmative action, universities have often become the sites where we wage struggles over racial justice and recognition, and equity in higher education has often been held up as a panacea for closing America's racial divide. One could go on, finding seemingly endless examples of cases where improved access to higher education was held up as a pathway to success for any number of marginalized or vulnerable groups. Of course, this viewpoint has been criticized on a number of grounds, most notably that it empowers certain members of marginalized groups at the expense of others and is an insufficient remedy to structural problems. In short, critics of this thesis have argued that only redistribution of our nation's wealth, reparations for slavery, the abolition of the prison system, and other far-reaching process can solve the problems that equity in higher education purports to solve. While I myself am not in a position to make too much of a judgment on these criticisms, I can turn to a particular moment in the history of rhetoric and composition studies to show an example of the contradictions they can present. In 1997, writing instructor Ira Shore published Our Apartheid, Basic Writing and Inequality. From his perspective as an instructor of basic writing, Shore argued that basic writing as an institution actually underserved and harmed the students it was designed to help. For one, Shore argued that basic writing proceeded from an inherently conservative paradigm, that certain students were in need of remediation in terms of their language skills or academic background. Secondly, Shore contended that basic writing courses required of some students, but not resulting in progress toward a degree, slowed down a student's progress towards their degree, and thus social participation and success. Shore's argument can seem pedestrian until he gets to his real point, that the way basic writing underserves its students actually serves a structural purpose. For Shore, Neoliberal economic policies were creating more and more low-wage jobs in the service industry and less high-paying jobs in the emerging creative class. Thus, by preventing students from becoming degreed, basic writing programs served the larger structural purpose of steering them out of college and into these low-paying jobs. Just to break the fourth wall for a second, I don't actually agree with this. I'm just explaining what Shore said. Backlash against Shore's piece was swift and unforgiving, but not for the reasons we might think. Rather than defending institutions of higher education against Shore's accusation that they serve as instruments of capital, his critics made the point that Shore was seemingly ignorant to the big picture as it pertained to basic writing programs in the United States. Specifically, Shore's opponents observed that the same basic writing programs he attacked were themselves under attack by the same neoliberal agenda he claimed they served. In essence, the argument was that basic writing programs were being slashed to the bone and eliminated in public institutions across the country, under the logic that they were too costly and produced little tangible results. On a broader scale, many of the developmental education programs and institutional mechanisms designed to support underserved and marginalized students were under attack. As part of a larger project to defund public education and privatize social responsibility. Paradoxically, Ira Shore's ostensibly radical attack on developmental education itself ran the risk for his critics of unwittingly folding into the same agenda he sought to oppose. This is the contradiction I alluded to earlier, that so-called radical critiques of the academy from its stakeholders can sometimes be co-opted by the academy's outside opponents if they fail to take heed of their larger structural background. I may have some explaining to do. After all, I just switched gears from trigger warnings to late 90s debates about writing pedagogy. Further complicating things, I'm about to continue discussing neoliberal austerity measures and their effect on public universities. I can only ask the reader to bear with me, or the listener in this case. So, the trends Shore's opponents pointed to did not end in 1997. They have continued unabated, with university and community college budgets slashed to the bone again and again. Despite cultural backlash, the deprofessionalization of university education has also continued, and universities suffering budget reductions have found themselves raising tuition and instituting pay freezes for both tenured and contingent instructors. In short, academics have seen themselves, in public institutions in particular, doing more with less every year, and students are seemingly expected to go into more and more debt to pay for what we were able to provide them under these circumstances. In this context and the struggle over diminishing resources which it has created, a few structural trends have emerged. First, much like in 1997, developmental education programs have either been hit hard or eliminated altogether by funding cuts, placing a university out of reach in practice and in theory for more and more people. Secondly, as institutions of higher learning struggle to meet their goals under a regime of austerity, the private sector and other outside forces have assumed greater control over their operations via the power of private donations and other incentives. Third, cultural struggles within the university have intensified as different factions struggle for funds and resources which are increasingly scarce. For example, administrations must decide whether to fund resource centers for queer students or repairs for crumbling bathrooms. Four, public institutions have come under fire for ostensibly poor retention and graduation rates, particularly among students from marginalized groups, in some cases being threatened with further defunding if they are unable to improve their outcomes. For example, proposed laws which fund public institutions based on their graduation rates as opposed to how many students they admit. And as an aside, if that sounds crazy, there's like 7 different states that are like trying to pass bills like this. This is like a real thing. Admittedly, this is a harrowing picture. As a basic writing instructor at such a university, I struggle daily coming to class aware of the grim realities, not only in my students' lives, but also behind the scenes in the institution we work in. I find it especially sad to implore my students to invest in their work in the face of the knowledge that statistically many of them will not graduate. So basically, I call attention to the issues facing public universities in the age of austerity to make the following point. When we struggle over our pedagogical principles and methods, we do not do so in a static or sterile environment. Just like outside forces affect what happens in our classrooms, our debates about pedagogy are in turn informed by outside forces within our institutions. One metaphor I often use is the experience of trying to stand for something while the ground shifts beneath my feet. Especially in a public institution where outside forces not only control administration's decisions, but also attack us in the press, seemingly from all sides, we underserve ourselves and our students when we ignore these realities and take our focus on principles into the realm of excess. Returning to our discussion of the struggle over trauma-informed pedagogies, maybe we can add a new layer to our analysis. Earlier, I argued that trigger warnings in trauma-informed pedagogies can serve as a threshold for participation and belonging in a community or space in which difficult topics will be discussed. I also noted that empirical research demonstrates that trauma-informed pedagogies improve learning outcomes for students with traumatic pasts, noting that they may be particularly helpful for students from particular demographics. Combining the two, I argued that the use of trigger warnings and related practices can be important tools for improving access and parity in public education, particularly in university education, particularly in open access and public institutions. Then, I implied that in hostility to these practices, something structural may be going on. Next, I noted that there are in fact efforts underway to make public institutions less accessible to marginalized and vulnerable students, on the grounds that many programs and resources seem to take in more than they put out. In short, some programs and institutions are taken in the neoliberal imagination to be a losing bargain. This can only mean that in that same neoliberal imagination, some students are a losing bargain. When we reflect on our earlier exercise concerning who benefits from the rhetoric of academic freedom when it is counterposed to the rhetoric of accessibility and the debate on trigger warnings, the argument may seem eerily familiar. In a sense, opposition to trigger warnings seems to share the same logic as the neoliberal assault on developmental education. Namely, in the interest of some higher purpose, either the sanctity of academic freedom or the logic of the market, sacrifices must be made. I don't think it's hyperbolic to state that our most vulnerable and marginalized students are themselves the sacrificial lamb for this rhetorical gesture in both cases. Earlier, I spoke on the project to make higher education more equitable in the wake of the Second World War. I also spoke on the notion that this project was considered to be a panacea for social inequality and alluded to its critiques. I also did my best to make the point that radical critiques of the university often fold themselves into neoliberal assaults on its most vulnerable stakeholders. Now that we can add a hostile federal government and mass shooting on college campuses to the mix, we can perceive ourselves as between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, we must admit that we cannot save the world with our syllabi. On the other hand, abandoning decades of social progress and the struggles of our predecessors in observation of that fact is also wrong. To me, as long as the American university stands, it can serve one purpose or another. Right or wrong, I would ultimately suggest that the struggle over trauma-informed pedagogy is symptomatic of a larger struggle, and that at least in a tactical sense, to struggle for trauma-informed pedagogies is to struggle for a particular vision of what purpose the university serves and whom it is for. So that's what I got. I'm going to sit down now.
Walter has left quite a bit of time for questions and comments, so the floor is open.
I read a report yesterday, actually in Science News, that said that decades ago there was this gap that existed in the lower classes, white and black, that they didn't have very good vocabularies. And when these studies were reassessed, they found that students from lower classes actually had fairly good vocabularies. And it kind of got me to thinking, well, you know, we have a lot of remedial reading, but then I thought, a lot of students aren't reading, at least when I was teaching, and I thought, you know, why is this? Is it more electronics? Is it the introduction of the internet? Is it the fact that, I mean, and then I thought, as you were talking about trauma, I thought, well, with the notion of PTSD throughout, in many places all over, in so many kinds, veterans, women, all that other stuff, is that what you mean by a trauma-infused pedagogy? I was somewhat confused by the term.
Yeah, so basically what I would say is that in terms of what you're observing about what appears to be like impediments to certain forms of literacy or academic participation, I am suggesting that people's traumatic experiences and then the larger social systems that sort of inform that do act as a impediment for participation in those kinds of things, and that pedagogies that are trying to like work around that or find a way through that difficulty is what I'm calling for, yes.
Thanks for a thought-provoking presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Could you talk a little bit more about what trauma-informed pedagogies look like on the ground besides behavior control learning? Like,
Yeah.
Where do you go down that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I guess off the top of the head, I would say, like, first and foremost, there's things that we can do with how we arrange the classroom. So, for example, and this is, I mean, here at Wayne State, this is difficult because they pretty much, you know, the classroom that they give us is the one that we can work from. But, like, so one example is there's a way that you can arrange the desks so that students don't feel like it's difficult to leave if they need to. So basically it's the sort of thing where a student might not necessarily have an issue where they need to leave the classroom every 15 minutes or whatever. But if they sit down and notice that it would be like difficult or awkward or like disruptive to leave, that feeling of being unable to leave is going to possibly produce like a stress response, for example. Or another thing that we can do is having students come to conferences and office hours in groups. So it's the sort of thing where students might not be super, it might not be super easy for them to be like alone with an authority figure. Especially like in my case, like with, you know, me being a man, right? Like a student might not be super comfortable about that. So having students come to conferences in groups can be helpful in that way. And then I think for another example, I think that sometimes when we have like free writing exercises and moments in which we encourage students to write about their own experiences, we can find thoughtful ways to address that in a way where like students don't feel like they have to disclose things about themselves that they don't want to. So for example, especially in questions of like, if we peer review stuff, I think it's the kind of thing where it's like, if you have 3 or 4 different students that are like writing a paper about like what their high school was like or whatever, one student might not necessarily be like really able to like kind of conceptualize something that happened to them in high school and like wouldn't be like wanting to present it in a peer review exercise, for example. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thanks.
I just want to add something to that, and this is not informed by any reading that I've done, but it's the practice that I have in my own classroom that I have found useful for myself. Offering students the opportunity to engage in that sort of free writing, and then grading it just by their being in the class doing it rather than actually reading it, so they have the opportunity to document what they want to document without feeling like it's going to be surveilled or that there's a grade assigned to it.
I find that a lot of the things that you're talking about seem to go hand in hand with disability studies.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I came, because I'm interested in disability studies. But the trauma for the veterans I'd like, I'm curious that if the trauma-informed pedagogy was correlated with disability studies, if it would be more welcome idea. That's just what I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think that, I think so, and I think that to a certain extent, I think it's fair to say that efforts of some people to like fold that conversation into the disability conversation is a large part of how we've been able to have any traction or success with this at all. So it's the sort of thing where a lot of times, and this is something that's come up a lot in my research as I've been working on this, is that if you present to administration or whoever, hey, we have this empirical psychology research that says this and that, and so it'd be really nice and cool if we could do this. They might not necessarily be super receptive, but if you can frame it as a disability issue, like you pointed out, then you can refer to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then you have a lot more traction because accessibility is a civil rights issue, and there's a constitutional sort of imperative there.
Well, that's where I'm making the connection,
Yeah.
especially with veterans. PTSD and trauma for anybody, women, men, any trauma like that, does actually create a disability. So I think that would be the best way to present it. So I don't like this idea of calling people wussies because we're creating safe spaces for people.
Yeah,
I mean, it has to do with access.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to ask this question. So you made a really, I think, significant point when you specified that trigger warnings are not just to prepare students for upsetting material. It's material that actually induces a stress response. I guess I'm just wondering, how do you distinguish between those two? How do you, the common, thing you hear from opponents of trigger warnings is oh, well, when does it stop? When do we, first we were trigger warning things like sexual assault, and then it was things like war and gunshots and things. So, but and people feel it's just increasingly broad use of trigger warnings to cover a broad range of traumatic experiences. So when does that, I don't know, how do you distinguish between just upsetting and actually traumatic? Is it all chemical or brain response? I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, that's an important question. I think that's important, and I guess I'm not sure how to answer it. But I think that off the top of the head right now, I would say that the whole part of the definition of trauma, and this is both in psychology research, but also if we read about historical trauma in South African literature or whatever, is that trauma to a certain extent is non-discursive, I guess, or let me think of it a better way to phrase that. I think part of the whole problem with trauma is that it's not something that a person can necessarily verbally represent or explain to another person. You can't represent it. So with that being said, I think it's the sort of thing where I think if a person says it's traumatic, it just kind of is, I guess.
Sure.
I don't mean that to be flippant. What I'm saying is that that's the best thing I can come up with, is that we just kind of gotta take people at their word, I guess. That's pretty much it.
And I just want to kind of add to the question, but kind of with a response. I think that by rather than having a trigger warning, hey, today we're going to be talking about sexual assault, trigger warning, saying this is the content of next class's lesson, and just doing that every single class helps avoid that problem of well, how do you know? Because for some people, reading about poor kids growing up in wherever like that's triggering, right?
Yes.
Reading a text by a dude who sexually assaulted his wife, that's triggering.
Yep.
So offering your students, and obviously that takes extra preparation on the instructor's part, but like knowing what you're going to be teaching the next class and telling your students that that's going to happen, I think is a good corrective for covering that broad range of things.
Yeah, I would agree.
I remember when I was teaching, we used to talk about crack babies going through the system.
Right.
You know, and now we talk about adult ADHD. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking, how much of this is, you know, now we have the opioid crisis, people are dealing with pain, and now we're talking about. So, I mean, all these psychological responses, I mean, when you put them in the context of an educational environment, I mean, that's a lot. I mean, just one student there is quite a lot to deal with, let alone a whole bunch of complex variety of syndrome. But yet, is it that the institutional response has been slow in general, or is the general that the whole culture is going through this, you know, kind of catharsis? It's kind of like, wow, you know.
I think that, I think that's a really important question. And what I would say is that what's interesting about, the one thing I noticed was you were talking about teaching and how like even one student with these challenges is difficult, right? And we would be remiss to like not say that it's hard, right? It is, you know. And the thing is, that's where, to me, we come back to the austerity question, which is to say that like these are like kind of like material and political issues. So it's like if we have X number of students with X number of challenges that need X amount of support and X amount of people who are trained to provide that support, et cetera, like for us being teachers, I myself, like my first inclination is like, well, I just need this. Whereas like from an administrator, they might think about it and just think about how much it costs. So for me, I think that a lot of times, like the conversations that we have about this are informed by the fact that there's increasingly less and less funds available to do the things that we need to do. So I guess like what I would say is I do agree that it's in some sense a cultural issue, and then like, you know, like we like don't really have like a public sphere anymore. Like we like don't really have politics anymore in America, you know, it's just a bunch of kind of bullshit. So like that's part of it, but I would say that focusing on like structural and like kind of economic paradigm that's producing what happens in the classroom, I think is like kind of the key to understanding the big picture, I guess.
Questions? Comments? No.
I have a comment. That was a really clear and accessible talk, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's clap them up.